Hi friends! So I'm sure by now that you've heard about the sale of the Talaris parcel in Laurelhurst to Seattle Public Utilities and are super excited about it, just like I am. So I wanted to make a quick video series about Talaris so that we can learn about the history of the site. I really think it's important to understand the history of the spot so that that can inform us about what it can be in the future. And it also helps us understand what we should be doing to better steward the land there, for example, by giving it back to Indigenous people. All right, so before we dive into the history, I just want to quickly give you guys a brief overview of the site that we're talking about. It is located here in Laurelhurst, just east of U Village and Union Bay Natural Area, which may be some places that y'all have been before. And it's just south of Seattle Children's Hospital, again, inside the Laurelhurst neighborhood. And you can see from satellite that really it's a big open space. It's 18 acres. There's only a few buildings on the site right now. And there is a creek that runs through it, but that creek isn't a pipe. So now that we know where we are, let's jump into learning about the history. Here's a map just from 1894, and let's go into full screen. So orienting ourselves, we see Green Lake over here. This is what is current day Laurelhurst. This is what is the Burke-Gilman Trail today. And so the Talaris site and parcel, that 18 acres that we are looking at and talking about today, would have been right here, basically at the mouth of Yesler Creek. There were 5 longhouses that were located along the northern edge of the bay, of Union Bay. One was near the UW steam plant, so that would have been about here or so. One was near or at Talaris itself, so about here or so. And then there was another one at the mouth of Union Bay. The people who lived around Lake Washington and in this area were known collectively as the Hachuabsh, or that is the people of Hachu, meaning a large lake, and that would have been referring to present-day Lake Washington. So that's people kind of living around the entirety of Lake Washington, but there is also a subgroup in particular that had the longhouses here that I was talking about, and those people were called the Hulu Wheel Absh, and they took their name from the Hulu wheel, meaning literally a tiny hole drilled to measure the thickness of a canoe, but it also referred to the narrow passage through the Union Bay Marsh. And so these people, they would have, fished the salmon that would have come up these creeks and all the waterfowl and birds that would have been abundant all around here. And they probably did some hunting of the elk and the deer and whatever other land animals were around as well. They would row boats up into Green Lake and fish in Green Lake. And they also had a burial ground at Foster Island. So they would put their dead into boxes and tie them up into the tree branches. If I'm imagining what it would have been like to live here back then, I just think it would have been so beautiful. And I, as a birder, I go to Union Bay a lot, Union Bay Natural Area. So I'm sure, other birders know what I'm talking about, but just pulling up a list of all the abundant bird species that would have been there, red-winged blackbirds, all the various ducks, all the various geeses, that would have been so yummy. Like imagine all the roast duck and roast goose that you could have eaten living in this area. And yeah, so these longhouses were, permanent structures, and these people would live here every winter. And I'm sure, again, these birds are here, they come here in the winter. And then the salmon are also running in the fall and winter. So I'm just sure it would have been a super abundant food area. And on top of that, you have all of your marsh plants and aquatic plants here too. And those would have been really good for making whatever tools or baskets or mats and things as well. So it would be nice to have sort of an estimate of the population numbers in this area in pre-colonial and pre-settlement times, but there are just a wide range of estimates. And the thing is that even before the first settlers arrived in the Seattle area in 1851, the local populations here had already decreased a lot because of smallpox and other epidemics, which had come much earlier than the actual settlers did, usually with explorers and fur traders. So even if we had an estimate of the population in, say, 1850 or something, that would have been an undercount from what it would have been before smallpox and other epidemics came to this area. All right, so next I wanted to tell you guys about the 3 different things, laws and things that happened that really enabled and sped up settlement of our area and that ultimately led to settlement of the Talaris parcel in the 1860s. So the first thing was the Preemption Act of 1841. It basically legalized the stealing of Indigenous land and squatting on that land and allowed people to pay pennies on the dollar to buy up that land legally. And so basically all you had to do was squat for 14 months and then be a white dude over 21 and a citizen of the US. And then if you met all those qualifications, you could buy up to 160 acres for $1.25 per acre. To put that in perspective, in today's dollars, that is about $50. So imagine $50 per acre for stealing Indigenous land up to 160 acres. And this was really, as this Wikipedia article says, this act, Preemption Act of 1841, helped to establish the doctrine of manifest destiny in North America and was really one of the main ways that we basically legalized and standardized and made normal the stealing of Indigenous land. So after that, in 1846, another really important thing happened, which is that the Oregon Territory became part of the United States. So before 1846, this area was disputed between Britain and the US. And finally, in 1846, they signed a treaty where Britain ceded this area to the US. And so it became officially part of the United States. And so with that, the US really started encouraging even more settlement in this area. In that vein, they also passed this Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, also known as the Donation Land Act. And, it was bad before when you were just paying pennies on the dollar to steal this Indigenous land. But now with this Donation Land Act, it was even worse because it was giving the land out for free. So basically with this law, if you were in the Oregon Territory area before 1850, you could have, and you were a single white dude, you could have 320 acres that you were squatting on for free of charge. And if you were married, then you could claim 640 acres. And just to put that in perspective in terms of how big that is, 640 acres is 1 square mile. So 1 mile by 1 mile. That's the amount of land. That is a huge amount of land for a couple. 320 acres, half that is a huge amount of land for one person. It's a huge amount of Indigenous land to steal and for free. So this act said that if you were here before 1850, that's how much land you could get. In between 1850 and 1855, you could still get free land, but you only get half that amount. So basically, if you were a single white dude, you could have 160 acres for free. And if you were a married white dude, you could have 320 acres between you and your wife. So that's crazy. And with all that, that really sped up settlement in the Oregon Territory area. After 1855, the Donation Land Claim Act ended, but that just meant that the earlier Preemption Act came into effect, and so you could still buy all of those acres of land up to 320 acres for only $1.25 an acre. And as the years went on, the price slowly did go up and the maximum size of the claims was decreased, but you could still get a lot of land for really cheap. So with that context, let's now talk about what happened to the Talaris parcel and how it got settled. So there was this guy named William Harvey Serber, and he was the one who ended up claiming the Talaris parcel. So he was from Indiana. He grew up on a farm. He came from a German family. His parents first settled in Virginia and then eventually settled again in Indiana, where he was born in 1834. In 1857, he went to St. Joseph and joined a wagon party to come over here to the West Coast. It just reminds me of the Oregon Trail game, which I played a lot of as a kid, but I do not remember how the game dealt with all of the indigenous genocide and land stealing and these unhinged land laws, of course. So he got here in 1859. And in Seattle, he worked as a carpenter and a pile driver. He also hunted a bunch in the evenings and sold that meat for extra money. And he really was a prominent figure in early Seattle history because when he arrived in this area in 1859, there were fewer than 100 European American settlers in the area. So after living here for a couple of years, he decided he wanted to homestead. And at this time, none of these lands over here were settled yet, but there was a road along Madison Street, and so people were able to get to Madison Park area and then boat over to the Laurelhurst area. So that's what he did, and apparently this area had his favorite hunting grounds, and so that's why he wanted to homestead over here. So in 1861, he filed a homestead claim on the land here. Just so you guys can see more clearly, here is a map of what that looked like when he made that claim. And so this is what that area would have been. And this says 1872 because that was when the final claim finally went through officially, but he had come here in 1861. So let's look at what this area corresponds to in Google Maps so we can orient ourselves. So that northern little square would have been this area between 45th and 50th and 35th and 40th here. So yeah, that square would have been this right here. And then this area down here corresponds to basically this whole area going from 35th Ave all the way to 45th Ave and then down to the water. So really, really large area like that. Oh yeah, and I remembered a couple more things I wanted to tell you guys about William Serber. So he was the first chief of police, like the first cop of Seattle, who got appointed by Henry Yesler, who was the mayor at the time in 1866. And not only that, but he also killed the last cougar slain in the vicinity of Seattle. And he also killed the last elk in King County. So this guy was like kind of the worst. But I also want to point out that, the police didn't exist in Seattle until the year 1866. They've only been around for like 150 years. We don't need them, you guys. Think about it. It's like, well, why did they, start having police? It's like, well, you started having people who were trying to claim all this private property and make it so that nobody else could come onto it. It kind of makes sense that they were like, oh, that means we need police. It's like, no, we don't need any of these things. All of these things are just made up constructions that settlers and white people were like, oh, I just like this. I want to live like this. I want to force everyone else to live like this. And we had indigenous land stewardship and people living here all the way until that time. They're still here today, but we, totally disenfranchised them and kicked them off only 150 years ago. We don't have to live like this. We can give their land back. It's just mind-boggling to think like you go to this giant piece of land, you're like, oh, it's mine. There's a bunch of longhouses here, but who cares? Let me just own this privately and make sure nobody else can ever come here ever again unless I say it's okay. And let me fence it off. Let me do all this stuff. Like, that is wild. We don't have to live like this. All right, so that was the 1860s. So let's talk about what happened after that. So in the 1880s, we had this new railroad, the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railway. So that was organized by Burke and Gilman, two dudes, in 1885, and by 1887, it reached Union Bay. So this railroad served the Union Bay area, and then eventually made it all the way to Bothell, and then up to Canada, and also over to Snoqualmie Falls. So as this railroad was being constructed, at the same time, Henry Yesler was also looking for a new place to site a new mill. And so he wanted it to be located close to a supply of trees that were still around. And all around Union Bay, there were still a bunch of trees, old growth at that time. And so he thought that would be a perfect place to locate a new mill. And so he had William Serber sell him some of the land in Union Bay in order to build this new mill. And so after Henry Yesler bought some land from Serber, he platted out the town, a new town, and called it Town of Yesler. And this area was, you can still clearly see it in the satellite view today. That was this area. So this area became the Town of Yesler in 1888. And then in 1890, he constructed a mill right at the mouth of Yesler Creek, just south of this town. And that became what was known as Yesler's Mill after the original one in downtown Seattle. The railroad going through here, which is now the Burke-Gilman Trail, really made it easy to both get logs to the site, to the new mill site, as well as to get lumber products out from there, back to the city or out into Bothell and then on to Canada and into Snoqualmie Falls and everything else. And also, because the mill was on the water like this, it was easy to float logs up to it as well from, as trees were getting cut down all around these areas around the lake and the bay. So the mill operated for 5 years, and then it burned down in 1895. This is what it looked like. This is the mill looking back toward what is now Laurelhurst and Serber's property. And then it got rebuilt into a shingle mill, which then also burned down sometime in the 1920s. In the meantime, Serber was also selling off other parts of his property. And so, for example, in 1906, he sold off some of the eastern part of his property, and that became platted into what was called Laurelhurst. Here you can see by 1912, he had sold off this part of his property to become the University Annex and Springbrook Terrace, as well as this part of his property that became Laurelhurst. And then again in 1888, he had sold this part to Yesler for him to make the town of Yesler, as well as to have the mill over here. So really by 1908, Serber was just left with this part of his property, which had Yesler Creek going through it and went down to the water still. And then just one other simpler way to see that is in this map, comparing the Serber property in 1872 to what it was in 1923. Then for the astute observers among us, you might notice that this shoreline kind of changed in between 1872 and 1923. So what happened? Well, something super, super dramatic that altered a lot of the city at the time, and that was the lowering of Lake Washington. So this is a map from USGS that shows what the water and land looked like before and after we lowered Lake Washington. So I'm sure a lot of you know about this. Lake Washington didn't used to connect to Lake Union and then out to Puget Sound. We made that happen by cutting the ship canal so that you could take a boat all the way from Puget Sound into Lake Washington or vice versa. And so when we made that connection from Lake Washington all the way out to the Sound. That caused the levels of Lake Washington to lower by about 10 feet. And that was a really big deal for the hydrology of the area. So let's zoom in here and take a look at what that meant for the Talaris parcel and Laurelhurst and Union Bay. So in this map, you have these black lines that show what used to be there, and then this orangey colored stuff is what is there now. So you can see that when the levels of Lake Washington lowered, a bunch of land got created. This made it so that the shoreline got extended out further. So if you see maps of the Union Bay shoreline from before 1916, you're going to see that it was more north, about a mile more north in some places, than it is today. The Talaris parcel used to be closer to the water, but is now a little bit more inland since we lowered the levels of Lake Washington. Lowering the levels of Lake Washington also made it so that Yesler's mill was basically not at the water anymore, so it became much less useful. All right, so that was in 1916. Now let's move on to the 1920s. So in 1923, Serber died. And so after that, his land kind of got sold off even more. And so one thing that happened was that Belvoir got platted. And so this is kind of the southern part of the remaining part of his land. So again, going back to this map, Belvoir was right here. So that got sold off in 1926 and platted to become single family lots. And so basically the only part remaining of his previous property was this part. So now we're finally getting into really being focused on the Talaris parcel, because after that Belvoir addition was platted, then we're really now left with this part, which in Google Maps would have been right here. So let's together read a little bit about what was going on starting in the 1920s with the Talaris parcel, or aka Serber's Marsh. So the Laurelhurst Community Club took great interest in what happened to the tracts of land north of the district. The peninsula, referring to Laurelhurst, was isolated on the south and east by water and on the west by UW. Although they wanted the undeveloped land to the north to be filled with single-family homes and fought any other type of building, they were not to have their way. Serber's Marsh had not been developed when the Belvoir addition was platted after Serber died in the 1920s. At first, the boggy land was sought by Laurelhurst Golf Club, Incorporated, which sold memberships in order to develop the tract as a small 20-acre course. But then the money shortage of the 1930s put an end to that idea. So I guess it was a good thing that they ran out of money, because otherwise the Talaris parcel could have just become another golf course that we have to fight against in the city. So I guess it's good that that, didn't work out. Then after that, the property fell into the hands of a developer who wished to build garden court apartments. So I was trying to find sources on what exactly did it mean that the property fell into the hands of a developer. So in the official Talaris landmarking document submitted to the city, it talks about that a little bit. The property reverted to King County for unpaid taxes. So I guess the Laurelhurst Golf Club Inc. people really ran out of money so much that they couldn't even pay their taxes. So then in 1939, these two guys bought the parcel from King County. And then for the next 10 years, it was under their control, and they tried to develop the land as a golf course, apartment buildings, and as single-family tracts, none of which succeeded, and the land remained unimproved. So I'm like reading this, and it's like, well, what does none of which succeeded mean? Like, why did it not succeed? How did it not succeed? And of course, the answer is same as to this very day, is because of Laurelhurst Community Club. So we go back to this source, and we see that once it was in the hands of this developer, they wanted to build the garden court apartments along the edge of the Yesler Creek outflow, but the area residents, aka Laurelhurst Community Club, typical, stopped the plans and heaved a sigh of relief when the UW purchased the land. Then the developer was able to retain only a small strip facing northeast 45th Street, which was downzoned for apartment and commercial use. So going back to the other source, to just see exactly when that happened, it was in 1949 that the University of Washington came to own the Talaris parcel. And then they owned it for 15 years, but didn't really do anything with it. And then UW sold it in 1964 to the Battelle Memorial Institute, which developed and built the site we see today. I was curious about what exactly happened with the small strip that the Laurelhurst Park Inc. developers were able to retain. I found these two things. So one was that they platted a little half block, I guess, of it. If we look on Google Maps, that this is in 1939, by the way. That was this little area here. So this little area got platted by those developers, and they were able to retain it to do that. So they sold that off as single family lots. They also, I found this document saying that they filed for a rezoning of this area between 38th and 39th along 45th. So looking at Google Maps, that corresponds to this area pretty much. It looks like they were able to put some commercial buildings and apartments on it eventually. So with that strip gone up here in the north, now we're left with finally the modern day Talaris parcel, which is this area right here. And originally this was 20 acres, and that was what the golf course was supposed to become. But with these lots gone, now we're at the modern day 18-acre Talaris parcel here. So the next thing I was curious about is, since UW started owning it in 1949, why did they not do anything with it for so long, for 15 years? Interestingly, they were doing a big housing boom for their students because the GI Bill was going on and World War II had just ended, and there were many, many vets who had returned that were going to school at UW, and they were not able to afford the housing. And so UW had to really build a lot more new student housing for them. And so looking at some aerial photos from the past, they built a bunch of new housing in 1946 in these areas for the students who are vets, married vets returning from the war and attending UW. And so you can start seeing that if you go to the 1952 aerial photo. Here's all of that new housing by UW for married students. They did it super, super quick because they were able to get some of the housing that was put up at the Hanford nuclear site, and they didn't really need that anymore since the war was over. So they brought those houses over here and just put them, next to the Montlake dump, which I'm sure it probably smelled pretty bad there at the time living there. But hey, it was a cheap place for these students to live that they could afford. But yeah, so that was in 1946 and then late 40s. And then again, UW acquired the Talaris parcel in 1949, but then didn't do anything with it. So I was like, why not? Because if you're building all this housing here and you need more and you have this huge parcel of land over here, why don't you build housing on it? I'm thinking it's because it was just so marshy and so swampy there. And, Yesler Creek was running through it. It wasn't in a pipe yet, right? It was, a real stream and creek running through this land. Is probably pretty hard to build on. So I'm guessing that's why they didn't end up doing anything with it. And, when they sold it to Battelle Memorial Institute, I'm sure Battelle Memorial Institute was having architects think about how they would be able to use the site working with the water that is, there. So as I said, in 1964, that was when UW sold the parcel to Battelle Memorial Institute. And so this is what they built there in the late 60s, and it is still what it looks like there today. So this parcel hasn't really changed since the late 60s or early 70s when Battelle built all of these buildings and added these water features, for example, and did all the landscaping that they decided on. If I had to summarize everything we went through today, I would say Talaris used to be an amazing place that was beautiful, full of wildlife and beautiful nature, that was an excellent spot for longhouses for the indigenous people, the people of Lake Washington who used to live here and who were here since time immemorial. Then some white dude decided that he wanted to own and privatize all of that land. So he came and he did that. His name was William Serber. He was Seattle's first cop and loved to kill an exorbitant number of animals, more than he needed. And then from there, he slowly sold off pieces of land all around the Talaris parcel until just the marshy part was left. And then after that, different developers tried to come in to make a golf course and then apartments. None of that worked out. And then it went to UW, and then UW didn't do anything with it. And then UW sold it to Battelle. They used it as a research facility. So now you guys are experts in the history of the Talaris parcel up until the 1970s. And I'm going to have a second video that talks about what happened from the 1970s to the present day. And this is going to be what I call the era of the Laurelhurst NIMBY. So that's going to be fun, and you should tune in. I gave my summary of everything we covered, but I also want to give some commentary now. And so if you're not into that kind of thing, you can just turn off the video. But basically, as I was doing all the research for this, I was just struck so much by how big of a change it was to go from a society that was communal, didn't have the concept of private property, didn't have police, to what we have today. And there is such a straight line to me from single family private property ownership to so many of the problems that we have today. So you think about all the NIMBYism, the affordable housing crisis, homelessness, all of that. It's a straight line from first stealing indigenous land to have homesteads that are privately owned, to then creating tiny homesteads when you plat all the single family home plats so that everybody is like a little lord of their little single family lot. And obviously only white people were able to do all of that homesteading and steal all of that land and legally own it. There are also a lot of environmental consequences, because when you have this privately owned land and all split up into these little lots like this, or big lots like this, you just really can't do the environmental stewardship that comes when property is commonly owned and publicly owned. When we talk about, for example, restoring the environment so that the salmon can thrive, it's just so hard when you have a bunch of these little private lots to try to coordinate and force people to care about this issue and do what's right on their property to make it good for the environment and for salmon, for example. Really, what started out as homesteading and then became single-family zoning is one of the most environmentally destructive land uses that we have ever invented. Of course, there's also like strip mining and industrial monoculture, agriculture, fossil fuel extraction, of course. But if we're talking about residential land use, this is just mind-bogglingly environmentally destructive. And then, of course, with this kind of land use, it created the demand for cars and paved the way for the era of cars in our cities, which we're still obviously suffering from all of those consequences today, whether we're talking about all of the highways that got built through Black, Brown, and Asian communities, or all of the arterial zoning that we have to contend with. But we absolutely don't have to live like this. A better world is always possible, and luckily, at least with this Talaris parcel, we will have it be publicly owned. So we're going to get to weigh in with what we think should happen with it. And that's going to be really awesome. All right, see you guys in the next video.